in the hidden corners of Boston's criminal world, where promises were broken as easily as bones, and human life meant nothing against the bitter wind blowing in from the harbor. A man once sat in a federal courtroom and admitted to doing the unthinkable. Stephen, the Rifleman Flemmi, his voice showing no feeling at all, told a completely silent room filled with shocked people that he had choked the light, help, and set loose two of the most deadly criminals in the entire history of American organized crime. This is the true story of Stephen Flemmi, a man who ended the lives of more than 20 human beings, including women he claimed to love with all his heart. Yet he walked around as a free man for many decades, because federal agents kept him safe under their powerful wing. This is a story about corruption so deep, so messed up, that it would eventually force agents to be arrested, reveal rot inside the system, and show that sometimes the scariest monsters of all are the ones wearing official badges. Before we start walking through this unbelievable trip into the dark parts of Boston's criminal world, I'd really like to know where you're watching from right now, and what time the clock shows where you're sitting. Are you getting cozy for the night, searching for a really deep story that will help you drift off to sleep? Or maybe you're working a late shift at your job, needing something interesting and long to keep you awake through those dark, quiet hours. Please drop a comment down below and let me know if you're the kind of person who enjoys these really detailed, true crime stories like this one. I'm talking about the kind that doesn't just scratch the surface, but actually goes deep and explores every crazy twist, every dark hidden corner, and every single result of the decisions people made. Then go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, this very moment. We're working on building a group of people who really enjoy stories that are carefully researched and thoughtfully told about the darkest parts of criminal history. Give us a like if you're prepared for a story that's crazier than anything someone could make up, because I promise you right now, the real truth about Stephen Flemmi is way more shocking than anything a Hollywood writer could ever create for a movie. And if you happen to know somebody who really enjoys gangster history, or true crime stories, or just incredibly well-told tales about real events that changed our world, please share this video with them. Now, let's start at the very beginning. Back at dig itself out of the terrible Great Depression. His mom and dad were Italian immigrants who had traveled all the way to America, hoping to find opportunities and build a better life. But instead, they found themselves raising their children in one of Boston's toughest, roughest neighborhoods during one of the hardest times the country had ever faced. The Flemmi family eventually settled down in the Roxbury section of Boston, an area that would later become famous for organized crime in the years to come. Roxbury back in the 1930s and 1940s was the kind of place where staying alive often meant you had to bend the rules a little bit, where being loyal to your neighborhood meant more than doing what was right for the whole city, and where young boys learned very early in life that earning respect didn't come from following society's laws, but from showing everybody how tough you were, how loyal you could be, and how willing you were to do whatever it took to protect your own people and your own territory. Stephen grew up surrounded by a close Italian-American community where the traditions and rules brought over from the old country still held. Tremendously shut and never talking to authorities wasn't just something people talked about in gangster movies. It was a real way of life, a basic rule that controlled how things worked in the neighborhood. You never, ever talked to the police. You never cooperated with any kind of government authority. You handled your problems within the community using channels that existed completely outside, and often fighting against the official legal system that was supposed to keep order. Young Stephen Flemmi wasn't originally marked for any kind of criminal greatness right from the start. From what most people say, he was a pretty normal kid, just growing up in a regular working-class neighborhood. He went to the local schools. He played in the streets with the other neighborhood children. And it seemed like he was heading for a totally ordinary kind of life. But the neighborhood itself was far from ordinary because of all its criminal connections. And eventually, those connections would pull him right into their orbit and change everything. His brother, Vincent James Flemmi, who everybody called Jimmy the Bear, was 6 years older than Stephen and would turn out to be a huge influence on Stephen's future criminal career. Jimmy was already showing signs of the violence and criminal behavior that would later define both brothers pretty clearly. The Bear was building a reputation as somebody you absolutely did not want to mess with. Somebody who was capable of extreme violence whenever the situation seemed to call for it. But before Stephen Flemmi would fully commit his life to crime, before he would earn his scary nickname, before he would become the FBI's most protected and most dangerous informant, there was a different period in his life that would ironically give him the skills and the reputation that would serve him. Simple. Not just kill in the middle of battle chaos, though he certainly did plenty of that too, but kill with amazing precision, with calm calculation, with steady hands and clear eyes that never wavered. Flemmi became known throughout his unit as an exceptional marksman with a rifle. He was a sniper who could pick off enemy targets from incredibly long distances that most soldiers couldn't even dream of hitting. His skill with a rifle was so amazing, his nerves stayed so steady, even under the worst pressure, that his fellow soldiers kind of war when he finally made it back home to Boston. Flemmi served his time in Korea with apparent distinction and did his duty. He came back to the United States with an honorable discharge papers, with real combat experience under his belt, and with a brand new understanding of his own personal ability to commit violence. Lots of veterans really struggled to fit their wartime experiences back into regular civilian life, wrestling with the terrible things they had seen and done during combat. But Flemmi didn't have any of those struggles at all. If anything, his time in the military had revealed something about himself that he found pretty empowering and useful. He was extremely good at killing people, and it simply didn't bother him the way it bothered other normal people. When Stephen, the Rifleman Flemmi, finally returned to Boston in the middle of the 1950s, he came back to a city that was going through some pretty major changes and shifts. The old ethnic neighborhoods were still mostly intact, but organized crime was growing stronger and more powerful, becoming more sophisticated and more ruthless in how it operated. The Italian Mafia, known in Boston as La Cosa Nostra, or sometimes just called the office by people in the know, was taking firm control over various different criminal businesses all throughout New England. Irish gangs were also fighting hard for their own territories and claiming their own ground. And everywhere you looked, there were opportunities waiting for young men who were willing to use violence to help criminal operations grow and succeed. Flemmi was exactly that kind of man, willing and able. He reconnected with his brother Jimmy, who by now was already deeply involved in the Roxbury gang scene and making a name for himself. Together, the Flemmi brothers started building their own reputations as enforcers, as the kind of men you could call when violence was absolutely necessary, when messages needed to be sent loud and clear, when problems needed to be solved permanently and forever. The Boston of the late 1950s and early 1960s had a thriving, criminal underworld running strong. Bookmaking operations, loan sharking businesses, hijacking trucks, robbery schemes. These things were the daily bread and butter of organized crime in the city. But underneath all those relatively normal criminal activities lurked something much darker and more terrifying. Murder for hire, intimidation through violence, and the slow, careful building of criminal empires that would eventually control entire neighborhoods and everything in them. Stephen Flemmi found his place in this dangerous world with disturbing ease, like he had been born for it. His military training in the army, his amazing marksmanship skills, his apparent complete lack of conscience when it came to killing people. All of these qualities made him extremely valuable to the various different criminal organizations that were fighting for power all across Boston. He wasn't just simple muscle that you hired for brute force. He was smart, he was calculating, he was patient and thoughtful. He could make detailed plans, carry them out perfectly, and then walk away leaving no trace behind. These were exactly the kind of qualities that would serve him extremely well in the decades that were coming up ahead. But Flemmi wasn't satisfied to just stay a simple street soldier doing small jobs forever. He had bigger ambitions and dreams. He watched carefully how power actually worked in Boston's criminal underworld, how alliances formed and then fell apart, how information became a kind of currency you could trade, how the smartest criminals weren't necessarily the toughest ones in a fight, but the ones who could see problems coming before they happened and position themselves in the right way accordingly. And maybe most importantly of all, Flemmi started to understand something that would completely define his entire criminal career going forward. The most powerful criminals out there weren't the ones who fought against law enforcement all the time. They were the ones who figured out how to use law enforcement for their own purposes and benefit. This important insight would eventually lead him into a relationship with the FBI that would protect him for 3 whole decades while he was putting together one of the most horrifying murder records in the entire history of American organized crime. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves in the story. Back in the late 1950s, Flemmi was still just a rising enforcer in the Roxbury gang scene, slowly building his reputation one violent act after another. The stage was all set up and ready. The Rifleman had come back home from war, and he was about to turn the streets of Boston into his own personal battlefield, where he made all the rules. The early 1960s were a time of big changes for Stephen Flemmi. He wasn't just known as Jimmy the Bear Flemmi's younger brother anymore, or just another Korean War veteran trying to find his place in normal life again. He was becoming the Rifleman for real, a name that carried serious weight in Boston's criminal underworld. A name that made people feel nervous just hearing it. A name that people associated with getting the job done efficiently, with total ruthlessness, and with an almost cold and clinical approach to violence that scared everyone. Working right alongside his brother Jimmy, Stephen Flemmi started taking on bigger, and more significant criminal jobs that paid more money and brought more power. The Flemmi brothers mostly did their work in the Roxbury area, where they grew up, but their reputation was spreading all throughout Boston's connected network of gangs and criminal enterprises that covered the whole city. They were known as reliable people, as men who could handle sensitive situations without drawing any unwanted attention from police. And most importantly, as men who would kill you if it became necessary, without any hesitation or any feelings of regret afterwards. Their connection to the New England Mafia was really important during this period of their lives. The Italian-American criminal organization known as the Patriarca crime family, named after its longtime boss Raymond L. S. Patriarca, controlled most of the organized crime throughout all of New England from its main base in Providence, Rhode Island. The Patriarca family's power reached all the way into Boston, where they kept up relationships with various local gangs and independent operators who worked for them sometimes. The Flemmi brothers, with their Italian heritage and their proven history of violence, were natural allies for the Mafia to work with. They weren't officially made members of the family. Stephen especially would keep a certain amount of independence throughout his whole career, but they were trusted associates who could be called upon for specific jobs when needed. This relationship with the Mafia would turn out to be really important, not just for their criminal advancement, but eventually for Stephen Flemmi's relationship with the FBI too. The Flemmi brothers' early criminal activities in the late 1960s included being involved in a series of murders that would later become known as the Bennett brothers' killings around Boston. This case would eventually become one of the most famous unsolved murder cases in Boston's whole history, even though investigators would later connect Stephen Flemmi directly to these particular killings. The Bennett brothers, Walter, William, and Edward were actually small-time bookmakers and criminals operating in Boston's criminal underworld. They ended up on the wrong side of some more powerful criminal interests somehow. And in the complicated system of Boston organized crime, that kind of mistake was often a death sentence waiting to happen. Walter Bennett just disappeared one day in December 1967, and nobody ever found him again. His brother William was found shot dead that same month not long after. Edward Bennett was killed in January 1969, while Flemmi wouldn't be officially connected to these particular murders until many decades later when everything came out. Investigators strongly believe that he and his brother Jimmy were directly involved in at least some of these killings, possibly acting on behalf of higher-level organized crime figures who wanted the Bennett brothers eliminated for their own reasons. The Bennett brothers' case would bother Boston for many decades to come, and when the real truth finally came out about Flemmi's involvement in their deaths, it would reveal a level of FBI corruption that shocked even the most experienced investigators who thought they had seen everything. But back in the mid-1960s, these big revelations were still many decades away from happening. Stephen Flemmi was just continuing to build his criminal resume, one murder after another, taking on jobs that made his reputation stronger, while slowly gathering the kind of power that comes from having everybody afraid of you. It was during this time period, in 1965 specifically, that Stephen Flemmi first came to the attention of the FBI in a completely new way. Not as a criminal who needed to be prosecuted and put in jail, but as a possible asset that could be developed and used. This initial approach by the FBI would eventually lead to one of the most controversial and damaging informant relationships in the entire history of the Bureau. But at the time when it happened, it probably seemed like just a routine attempt to recruit somebody useful. The FBI's strategy for fighting organized crime back in the 1960s depended heavily on developing informants who were actually inside criminal organizations and could provide inside information. The basic idea was pretty simple. Recruit criminals who could provide valuable intelligence about their associates and partners, especially about the Italian Mafia, which the FBI saw as the biggest organized crime threat facing the country. In exchange for giving this information, the FBI would offer protection from prosecution, show leniency when possible, and in many cases, allow them to keep committing crimes without too much interference from law enforcement. This strategy, while it did work for getting intelligence, created a massive moral problem that was hard to ignore. It meant the FBI was basically partnering with active criminals who were breaking laws, letting them continue their illegal activities in exchange for getting information about other criminals who were also breaking laws. In theory, the FBI would let informants commit minor crimes while helping to prosecute major criminals who were more important. In real-life practice, as the Stephen Flemmi case would eventually show everyone, the FBI often had no idea at all what crimes their informants were actually committing behind their backs. And in some cases, FBI agents actively protected informants from being prosecuted for serious crimes, including murder, which is about as serious as it gets. The initial FBI approach to Flemmi back in 1965 didn't immediately result in him becoming an informant for them. He was cautious about it, like any smart criminal would naturally be. Cooperating with the FBI was incredibly dangerous if word ever got out about it. He could be killed by his own criminal associates for being a rat. But the seed had been planted in his mind for later. The FBI saw real potential in Flemmi as a source. He was smart. He was well connected to important people. He was active in serious criminal enterprises that mattered. And most importantly, he seemed to understand that information could be traded for protection very effectively. Meanwhile, Flemmi kept doing his criminal activities all throughout the late 1960s without slowing down. He was involved in the full range of traditional organized crime operations: illegal gambling, loan sharking, robbery, hijacking trucks, and more murder for hire when people needed somebody taken out. His reputation as the Rifleman was already well established by now. When someone needed to be killed, when a problem needed to be eliminated permanently, Stephen Flemmi was one of the names that came up in those conversations among criminals planning things. He was extremely careful and detailed in how he approached murder. Unlike some criminals who killed in fits of rage or in sloppy, impulsive moments, Flemmi planned his killings very carefully beforehand. He studied his targets, learned their daily routines, identified moments when they would be vulnerable and alone. When he finally struck, he struck with maximum efficiency, and, critically important, he understood the importance of making bodies completely disappear, of leaving absolutely no evidence behind, of creating enough confusion and fear that witnesses wouldn't dare come forward to the police. This time period also saw Flemmi starting to build up wealth from his criminal activities that was significant. He wasn't flashy and showy in the way some criminals were, driving expensive cars and wearing expensive clothes that drew attention. Flemmi understood very well that drawing attention to yourself was dangerous and could get you caught. He lived reasonably well and comfortably, but stayed within the bounds of what could be explained away. If anyone ever looked too closely at his finances and wondered where the money came from, this kind of discipline would serve him very well in the decades that were coming up ahead. His brother Jimmy the Bear Flemmi was also becoming more prominent in Boston's criminal underworld during this same period of time. Though Jimmy's approach to things was often more violent and less controlled than Stephen's calm style, the Bear had a reputation for explosive violence that could happen any time, for losing his temper and creating problems that then needed to be cleaned up by others. Stephen, by contrast, was cold, calculated, and always in control of himself. He killed when killing served a useful purpose, never out of simple anger or ego getting in the way. The brothers worked together on various criminal enterprises over the years, but they were also establishing their own independent operations and connections separately. Stephen especially was positioning himself as someone who could work with multiple different criminal organizations without being completely tied down to any single one. This independence was a smart strategic choice. It gave him flexibility and options that criminals who are fully committed to a single organization didn't have available to them. By the end of the 1960s, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi was a made man in every sense except for the official Mafia ceremony with blood and vows. He was feared and respected throughout Boston's criminal underworld by everyone. He had money, he had power, and he had a growing list of dead bodies that were attributed to his work over the years. He had successfully navigated the dangerous world of organized crime for over a whole decade without ever being prosecuted for any major crimes that could put him away. And he was about to make the connection that would define the rest of his criminal career and create one of the most scandalous chapters in FBI history that people still talk about. He was about to meet James Whitey Bulger in the early 1970s. Boston's organized crime landscape was going through some significant changes during this time. The old power structures that had been in place for years were being challenged by new players. Territories that had been settled for a long time were being contested and fought over, and new alliances were forming between different groups. It was in this environment of shifting allegiances and new opportunities popping up that Stephen Flemmi would create the partnership that would define his criminal career and enable 3 decades of murder and chaos. Under FBI protection that nobody could stop, James Joseph Bulger Jr., known all throughout Boston as Whitey because of his bright platinum blonde hair that stood out, was a criminal from a different background than Flemmi, but he had similar ambitions driving him forward. Born back in 1929 in South Boston, Bulger came from the Irish-American community that completely dominated that particular neighborhood where he grew up. He had served time in federal prison before, including a stretch at the famous Alcatraz for bank robbery back in his younger years. But by the early 1970s, he was out of prison and working on building his own criminal empire in South Boston, where he knew everyone. South Boston, or Southie, as locals called it affectionately, was a fiercely closed-off neighborhood that didn't trust outsiders, mostly Irish-American, with its own codes of behavior, its own customs, and its own criminal traditions that went back generations. Bulger understood Southie in a way that people from outside could never really grasp. He knew how to move through the neighborhood properly, how to gain the respect and fear of local people, how to present himself as a protector of the neighborhood, even while he was victimizing many of those same neighbors through his criminal activities behind the scenes. The exact circumstances of how Flemmi and Bulger first connected with each other are a bit unclear and fuzzy, lost in the fog of different criminal stories that contradict each other, and self-serving testimonies that would come out many decades later when everything fell apart. What's clear and certain is that by the early 1970s, these two men recognized in each other a similar spirit and a potential partner who could help them expand their respective criminal operations in new ways. Flemmi brought to the partnership his connections to Italian organized crime, his reputation as an efficient killer who got the job done, his experience with various different criminal enterprises, and his methodical, calculating approach to crime that was very effective. Bulger brought his complete control over South Boston, where he was king, his political connections. His brother, William Billy Bulger, was becoming an important figure in Massachusetts politics, eventually becoming president of the Massachusetts State Senate with real power, and his own ruthless willingness to use violence to achieve whatever goals he had in mind. Together, they would become two of the most powerful criminals in Boston's entire history. Feared by all, the alliance between Flemmi and Bulger was made official through their association with the Winter Hill Gang, a mostly Irish-American criminal organization based in Somerville, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. The Winter Hill Gang had been involved in various criminal activities throughout the Boston area for many years already, and by the middle of the 1970s, it was becoming one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the whole region, expanding its reach. The partnership between Flemmi and Bulger wasn't just about combining their criminal enterprises together. It was strategic on multiple different levels that helped both of them. Together, they could operate across the ethnic boundaries that typically divided Boston's criminal underworld into separate groups. Flemmi could deal with Italian Mafia figures because of his heritage, while Bulger controlled the Irish neighborhoods completely. They could play different criminal factions against each other cleverly, keeping power through a combination of violence, intimidation, and strategic intelligence gathering. And most importantly, they could use Flemmi's developing relationship with the FBI to protect their expanding criminal empire from prosecution. In 1975, Stephen Flemmi officially became an FBI informant on paper. This wasn't his very first involvement with the FBI at all. He had been approached before, and there may have been earlier informal cooperation that wasn't recorded. But 1975 marked the beginning of his official status as a top echelon informant, which was the FBI's special designation for its most valuable and important sources. This informant relationship was handled at first by FBI Special Agent Paul Rico and later by John Connolly, an agent who would become completely infamous for his corrupt relationship with Flemmi and Bulger down the road. Connolly was from South Boston himself originally, had grown up knowing the Bulger family personally, and brought his own complicated loyalties into his relationship with his informants that would cause big problems. The basic idea of the informant relationship from the FBI's point of view was pretty simple and made sense on paper. Flemmi and later Bulger, who was also brought in as an informant, would provide useful intelligence about the Italian Mafia's operations in Boston to help catch them. The FBI was involved in a long-term campaign to break up the Patriarcha, crime family, and other Mafia organizations all throughout the United States. And informants like Flemmi, who had direct access to Mafia activities and knew what was happening, were considered incredibly valuable assets worth protecting. In exchange for giving this important information, the FBI would protect Flemmi from being prosecuted for his crimes. If local police started investigating him, the FBI would step in and intervene. If other law enforcement agencies tried to build cases against him, the FBI would warn him ahead of time. If indictments seemed like they were coming soon, the FBI would tip him off so he could prepare. This protection was supposed to have limits, though. Informants weren't supposed to be allowed to commit murders. For example, that was off limits, but in actual practice, the FBI's protection of Flemmi and Bulger would turn out to be almost absolute and without limits. What the FBI either didn't know at the time or chose to ignore on purpose was that while Flemmi and Bulger were providing information about the Mafia, they were using that FBI protection to eliminate their own competitors and build their own criminal empire even bigger. They weren't just informants who happened to commit some minor crimes on the side. They were active, very productive criminals who happened to provide some information to the FBI while using their informant status as a shield against prosecution for serious crimes. The information they provided to the FBI was often chosen strategically to benefit themselves. They would give up Mafia members they wanted out of the way for their own reasons, or criminals who were competing with their own operations, or intelligence that made them look valuable without actually hurting their own criminal activities. They played the FBI like a musical instrument, understanding completely that as long as they provided information that led to Mafia prosecutions, the FBI would protect them from virtually anything they did. John Connolly, their FBI handler, was either completely involved in this arrangement or deliberately blind to what his informants were actually doing behind his back. Evidence that came out later strongly suggests that Connolly actively protected Flemmi and Bulger, warned them about investigations coming, helped them avoid being prosecuted, and in some cases may have actively helped them get rid of rivals by giving them intelligence about cooperating witnesses or law enforcement activities that were happening. This corrupt relationship between the FBI and two of Boston's most productive criminals would continue for nearly 2 decades straight, during which time Flemmi and Bulger would commit numerous murders together, build a criminal empire that controlled significant portions of Boston's criminal underworld, and gather up wealth that would eventually reach into the millions of dollars for both of them. The Winter Hill Gang, with Flemmi and Bulger as leading members running things, controlled criminal activities throughout the Boston area during this entire period without much challenge. They controlled gambling operations all over, ran extensive loan sharking businesses that trapped people in debt, moved into drug trafficking despite Bulger's public claims that he didn't allow drugs in his territory, extorted money from business owners who were scared, and got rid of anyone who threatened their operations or showed them disrespect. Their way of operating was brutally effective and simple. They would find criminals who were operating without permission in their territory and give them a simple choice: pay money to Bulger and Flemmi regularly or face the consequences that would follow. Those consequences were often fatal for the person involved. They built up fear throughout Boston's underworld, creating an environment where people were terrified to cross them in any way, knowing that doing so could result in disappearing permanently without a trace. They also controlled information flow carefully. Their relationship with the FBI meant they often knew about investigations before they became serious threats to them. They knew who was cooperating with law enforcement, who was wearing a wire to record them, who was giving information to the police. This knowledge allowed them to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and to get rid of threats before those threats could turn into actual prosecutions that would put them in jail. The South Boston criminal empire that Bulger controlled, with Flemmi as his key partner doing important work, was unlike typical organized crime operations in one significant way that helped them. Bulger positioned himself as a protector of the neighborhood, as someone who kept harder drugs out of Southie, who punished child molesters and rapists that regular police wouldn't touch, who helped some neighborhood people when they were in trouble. This public image, carefully built up over many years, gave him a degree of community protection that most criminals never achieve at all. Meanwhile, behind this fake image of the neighborhood tough guy with a moral code, Bulger and Flemmi were running one of the most vicious criminal operations in Boston's entire history without anyone stopping them. They were loan sharking, charging incredibly high interest rates that trapped people in endless cycles of debt they could never escape. They were shaking down business owners for protection money regularly. They were involved in the drug trade despite Bulger's public claims that he opposed it. And they were killing anyone who got in their way or who they saw as a threat to their power. The FBI's protection of these two men during this period represents one of the most terrible examples of law enforcement corruption in all of American history that has ever been exposed. The Bureau was so focused on taking down the Italian Mafia that they enabled two criminals who were by any fair measure just as dangerous and just as productive in their criminal activities as the Mafia itself. The FBI allowed the number of dead bodies to keep rising year after year, as long as Flemmi and Bulger kept providing intelligence about Mafia activities that helped the Bureau. By the end of the 1970s, Stephen Flemmi and Whitey Bulger were two of the most powerful criminals in all of Boston. Untouchable, they had FBI protection that was solid. They controlled significant criminal territories across the city. They had gotten rid of most of their serious competitors who might challenge them, and they had gathered up both wealth and power that was impressive. The bodies were already piling up behind them, though many of those murders wouldn't be officially connected to them until many decades later when the truth came out. The stage was all set for what would become a time of terror that would last all through the 1980s and into the 1990s, during which time the number of dead bodies would continue to rise, even as the FBI stubbornly protected its valuable informants from the consequences of their terrible actions. The Rifleman had found his perfect partner in crime, and together they would turn Boston into their own personal hunting ground, where they made all the rules. The 1980s in Boston completely belonged to Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi, without question, while the rest of America was experiencing the Reagan years. The rise of yuppie culture and the beginning of the digital revolution changing everything. Boston's criminal underworld was firmly under the control of two men who had perfected the art of killing without ever facing consequences, protected by the very law enforcement agency that was supposed to be stopping them from hurting people. The murders committed by Flemmi during this period, both alone and together with Bulger as partners, show a chilling pattern of violence used for business reasons, for personal reasons, and simply to get rid of anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to their operations. These weren't crimes of passion or killings in the heat of some angry moment. They were carefully calculated, planned executions carried out with the cold efficiency that it earned Flemmi his nickname decades earlier, back in Korea during the war. One of the most significant aspects of Flemmi and Bulger's operation was how they approached potential witnesses or informants who might talk. In the criminal underworld, information is real power, but it's also a serious danger. Anyone who might talk to law enforcement, anyone who might become a cooperating witness, anyone who might provide testimony against them. These people were immediate targets for being eliminated permanently. The irony of this situation was almost too perfect to believe. Flemmi and Bulger themselves were FBI informants giving information, yet they were murdering people for the crime of potentially informing on them to authorities. They were using information they received from their FBI handlers about cooperating witnesses and ongoing investigations to find and get rid of people who might threaten them. The FBI was in effect providing them with a list of people to kill without even knowing it. Let's talk about some specific victims here, because these weren't just numbers or statistics on some paper somewhere. These were real living people with families who loved them, lives they were living, and futures ahead of them that were completely erased by Flemmi and his partner without mercy. Brian Halloran was a criminal associate who became convinced that Bulger and Flemmi were going to kill him eventually. In 1982, Halloran started cooperating with the FBI, providing information about their criminal activities to try to save himself. What Halloran didn't know at the time was that his FBI handlers were sharing information about his cooperation with the very men he was informing against behind their backs. In May 1982, Halloran and his friend Michael Donahue were murdered in a shooting in South Boston. While Flemmi wasn't the actual shooter in this particular case, Evidence strongly suggests Bulger carried out the actual shooting himself. Flemmi was fully involved in planning the murder beforehand and getting rid of evidence afterward to cover it up. Michael Donahue was especially tragic in this story. He wasn't involved in crime at all. He was an innocent person. He was simply giving Halloran a ride home that night. He was in the wrong car at the wrong time, and he died because of Bulger and Flemmi's determination to silence a witness who might testify. His widow and children would spend many decades seeking justice that was hard to get, and their sad story became one of the most heartbreaking parts of the eventual investigation into FBI corruption that finally happened. The gambling and loan sharking operations that Flemmi and Bulger controlled were massive operations that made huge amounts of money. They operated all throughout Boston, taking bets on sporting events constantly, running numbers games where people gambled, and lending money at incredibly high interest rates to people who were desperate for cash and had nowhere else to turn. These operations created millions of dollars every single year, money that flowed directly into their pockets with the FBI's implicit protection behind them. The loan sharking business was particularly nasty and cruel. They would lend money at interest rates so high that paying it back was nearly impossible for anyone, then use the debt as leverage to take over businesses from people, to force people into criminal activity they didn't want to do, or simply to terrorize victims until they paid back way more than they had originally borrowed. Some victims, unable to pay and terrified of what would happen to them, killed themselves rather than face it. Others just disappeared completely. Added to the growing body count that surrounded Flemmi and Bulger everywhere they went, extortion was another key part of their business model that worked well. They moved through Boston, finding successful businesses and demanding regular payments for protection from harm. The protection, of course, was from Bulger and Flemmi themselves, which was the real threat. Business owners who refused to pay up faced more and more violence, vandalism to their property, beatings to themselves, and ultimately, in some cases, death for refusing. The fear they created was so widespread that most businesses simply paid up without fighting, treating it as a necessary cost of doing business in Boston that couldn't be avoided. And then there was drug trafficking as another income stream. Despite Bulger's carefully built image as someone who kept hard drugs out of South Boston to protect the neighborhood, evidence would later come out showing that he and Flemmi were deeply involved in the drug trade, including cocaine trafficking that was big business. They took a cut from drug dealers operating in their territory as tribute, and in some cases, they actually helped bring in and distribute drugs themselves for more profit. The FBI's protection of Flemmi during this period was complete and shocking in how far it went. When state police tried to investigate Flemmi and Bulger, the FBI stepped in and stopped them, claiming that any investigation would mess up their informants and their case against the Mafia. When local police developed leads, the FBI would step in and shut down the investigations completely. When prosecutors tried to build cases against them, the FBI would hide information or claim that the investigations put national security interests in danger somehow. FBI agent John Connolly was at the center of this protection scheme that kept them safe. Evidence that came out later showed that Connolly wasn't just handling informants in the normal way. He had become, in effect, a member of their criminal organization himself, completely compromised and actively working to protect them from prosecution while they continued to murder, extort, and terrorize innocent people. Connolly would tip off Flemmi and Bulger when investigations were getting close to them. He would tell them who was cooperating with law enforcement, information that often resulted in those witnesses being murdered before they could testify. He would make false reports to make his informants look more valuable than they actually were, justifying continued protection even as the number of dead bodies kept going up. And he would use the FBI's authority to shut down investigations by other law enforcement agencies, claiming that Boston police or state police investigations would mess up important FBI operations against the Mafia. The Massachusetts State Police, who were doing their own investigations into organized crime, became more and more frustrated with the FBI's constant interference in their work. They could see clearly what was happening right in front of them. They could see that Bulger and Flemmi were very productive criminals operating with apparent freedom and no consequences. But every time they tried to build a case against them, the FBI would step in and shut it down completely. This created a bizarre and messed up situation where different law enforcement agencies were effectively working against each other's goals. The state police were trying to prosecute Flemmi and Bulger for their criminal activities, while the FBI was actively protecting them and shutting down those investigations. It was a complete failure of law enforcement working together that allowed two of the most dangerous criminals in Boston to operate freely for many years without being stopped. The murders during this period followed several patterns that can be seen. Some victims were criminals who got on the wrong side of Flemmi and Bulger's operations. Competitors, associates who were suspected of stealing money from them, criminals who disrespected them or refused to pay them tribute money. These murders served business purposes clearly, getting rid of competition and sending messages about what happened to people who crossed Bulger and Flemmi. Other victims were possible witnesses or informants who might talk, people who the FBI accidentally marked for death by sharing information about cooperating witnesses with Connolly, who then passed that information to his criminal informants. These murders were about protecting themselves, getting rid of anyone who might provide testimony or evidence that could lead to prosecution. And then there were personal murders, killings motivated by relationships, jealousy, or simply the convenience of getting rid of someone who had become inconvenient to have around. These murders, maybe more than any others, show how deeply evil Flemmi was and how much the FBI's protection had created a situation where he felt he could kill anyone, anytime, for any reason, without ever facing consequences for it. The methods they used varied depending on the situation. Some victims were shot dead. Others were strangled to death slowly. Some bodies were buried in locations that stayed secret for many decades. Others were cut into pieces to hide them better. Teeth were pulled out to prevent identification, and bodies were buried in multiple different locations to make finding them and identifying them almost impossible. Flemmi became known for his methodical approach to getting rid of bodies, understanding completely that a body never found meant a murder much harder to prove in court. There was a house in South Boston that became especially famous in later testimony when people talked. A location where Flemmi and Bulger would take victims, where they would question them roughly, torture them if they felt it was necessary, and ultimately kill them in the end. The house had a basement where bodies could be kept temporarily hidden, and where the work of cutting them up and disposing of them could be carried out away from anyone who might see. This location would appear in some of the most disturbing testimony that would come out many decades later during trials. The gambling operations were sophisticated for their time period. Flemmi and Bulger employed many different people to take bets, to keep records organized, to collect debts from people who owed. They moved money through various businesses to hide where it really came from. They paid off some law enforcement officials and scared others into leaving them alone. They created a network of criminal activity that touched hundreds of different people throughout Boston regularly. The loan sharking operation was equally large and widespread. They had many different collectors working for them, going door to door, demanding payment, threatening violence, and occasionally carrying out that violence when debtors couldn't pay what they owed. The interest rates they charged, often several 100% every year, made it nearly impossible for borrowers to ever truly pay off their debts completely. This created long-term streams of income for them and gave them ongoing power over many different people throughout the city who were trapped. By the middle of the 1980s, Flemmi and Bulger were extremely wealthy by criminal standards, richer than most. They had many different sources of income flowing in all the time: gambling, loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking, and various other criminal enterprises they ran. They had investments in legitimate businesses that they had either taken over through threats or had started themselves to clean their dirty money. They made investments in real estate property. They gathered up cash that they hid in various secret locations. By the 1990s, both men had a lot of wealth hidden away safely. Money that would allow them to live comfortably, even if their criminal operations were eventually shut down somehow. The partnership between Bulger and Flemmi wasn't without tensions between them sometimes. They had different styles of doing things. Bulger was more paranoid about everything, more willing to use extreme violence, even when it might not be strictly necessary for the situation. Flemmi was more calculating, more willing to take time to plan operations carefully and think things through. They disagreed sometimes on how to handle specific situations that came up, on which crimes to commit, on how to deal with people who crossed them in various ways. But despite these tensions between them, the partnership lasted for nearly 2 decades, because both men understood that they were more powerful together than they would be apart. Bulger needed Flemmi's connections and his methodical approach to crime that worked well. Flemmi needed Bulger's control over South Boston and his political connections that helped them. Together, they created something more powerful than either could have built alone by themselves. Their FBI protection was the secret ingredient that made everything possible for them. Without that protection, they would have been investigated, prosecuted, and put in prison long before they gathered up the number of bodies and the wealth that they achieved together. The FBI's decision to protect them year after year, murder after murder, represents a complete failure of law enforcement ethics and oversight that should never have happened. By the early 1990s, Bulger and Flemmi had been operating with FBI protection for nearly 2 decades straight. They had become extremely wealthy beyond most criminals' dreams. They had killed at least 20 people, probably more that nobody knows about. They had destroyed countless lives through their criminal activities, and they seemed untouchable, like nothing could stop them. But forces were gathering together that would eventually bring their reign of terror to an end at last. New investigators were looking at old cases with fresh eyes that hadn't been corrupted. Journalists were connecting dots that previous reporters had missed entirely. Families of victims were refusing to give up their search for justice, no matter how long it took. And within the FBI itself, there were agents who were becoming more and more uncomfortable with the Bureau's protection of 2 of Boston's most dangerous criminals. The end was approaching slowly, though neither Bulger nor Flemmi seemed to realize it yet. They had gotten away with murder, literally for so long that they appeared to believe they were truly untouchable forever, that the FBI's protection would last for their whole lives, that they would never face consequences for their crimes. They were wrong about that. The walls were closing in around them. And when those walls finally collapsed completely, the full scope of their crimes and the FBI's corruption would shock even people who thought they knew how bad things had gotten in Boston over the years. The early 1990s marked a turning point in the long, corrupt relationship between the FBI and its 2 most protected and most dangerous informants ever. Forces that had been building for many years were finally coming together in ways that would eventually expose one of the most shameful chapters in FBI history and bring Stephen Flemmi's criminal career to an end at last. The first cracks in the protective wall the FBI had built around Flemmi and Bulger appeared in the form of investigators who were willing to look past the FBI's claims that these men were untouchable because of their informant status. The Massachusetts State Police had been frustrated for many years by the FBI's constant interference in their investigations. Every time they tried to build a case against Bulger and Flemmi, the FBI would step in and shut them down, claiming that state police investigations would mess up federal cases against the Mafia. But by the late 1980s and early 1990s, some state police investigators were becoming more and more skeptical of these claims they heard. They could see clearly that Bulger and Flemmi are running large criminal enterprises all throughout Boston. They had informants of their own who were providing information about murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and other serious crimes committed by the Winter Hill Gang regularly. They had evidence that people were disappearing all the time, that witnesses were being killed, that a time of terror was being kept up through systematic violence. And yet the FBI continued to protect these two men, claiming they were too valuable as informants to be prosecuted. Some state police investigators started to suspect the real truth that the FBI's informant program had been completely corrupted, that FBI agents were protecting criminals who were committing serious crimes, and that the FBI's institutional commitment to taking down the Mafia had blinded it to the crimes being committed by its own informants. At the same time, journalists were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions that needed answers. The Boston Globe newspaper in particular had reporters who were looking closely at the relationship between Bulger and law enforcement. They were hearing stories from sources in law enforcement about FBI protection being given. They were hearing from victims' families about investigations that led nowhere. They were starting to connect dots that previous reporters had missed entirely. The Boston Globe's coverage of Bulger and Flemmi, which would eventually help break apart the FBI's protection scheme, was careful and methodical in how they did it. The reporters understood that they were dealing with dangerous men who had killed many people, and they understood that they were possibly exposing corruption at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. It could be dangerous, but they kept going, slowly building a public record of questions about why these two famous criminals seemed immune from prosecution. Within the FBI itself, there were growing concerns about the informant program, and specifically about the relationship between Agent John Connolly and his informants. Some FBI agents in Boston were becoming uncomfortable with how protective Connolly was of Bulger and Flemmi. They wondered why other law enforcement agencies were constantly being shut down when they tried to investigate. They questioned whether the intelligence Bulger and Flemmi were providing was really valuable enough to justify the protection they received constantly. These internal concerns led to internal FBI reviews of the informant program to check things out. But the FBI's institutional culture, which valued loyalty and protecting sources above almost everything else, made it difficult for these concerns to be taken seriously by leadership. Agents who raised questions about Connolly's handling of his informants were often seen as disloyal, or as not understanding how important the top echelon informant program was in fighting organized crime. By 1994, however, things were changing in ways that couldn't be ignored anymore. Federal prosecutors in Boston, working together with state police investigators, were building a racketeering case against many members of the Winter Hill Gang. This wasn't just a local investigation that the FBI could easily shut down like before. This was a federal case now, and the prosecutors involved were determined to see it through no matter what. As the investigation moved forward, it became more and more clear that the evidence against Bulger and Flemmi was strong and solid. The prosecutors had testimony from cooperating witnesses who could connect them to murders, extortion, and other serious crimes. They had physical evidence from some crime scenes that couldn't be explained away. They had financial records showing wealth they couldn't account for legally. And most importantly, they had witnesses who were willing to testify, despite their fear of what would happen to them. The investigation reached a critical point in late 1994, when federal prosecutors decided that they had enough evidence to seek indictments against Bulger, Flemmi, and many other members of the Winter Hill Gang. The charges would include racketeering, extortion, and murder charges. This created an extraordinary situation that had never happened before. The FBI was about to have two of its most valued informants indicted for serious federal crimes that could put them away forever. For years, the FBI had justified protecting Bulger and Flemmi by claiming their intelligence was crucial to cases against the Mafia. Now, federal prosecutors, part of the same Department of Justice that supervised the FBI, were preparing to prosecute these men for crimes that the FBI had in many cases known about or could have known about if agents had been paying attention properly. The institutional conflict within the Justice Department was significant and serious. FBI officials in Boston argued that the prosecution would destroy valuable sources and damage ongoing investigations they cared about. Federal prosecutors argued that no intelligence was valuable enough to justify protecting criminals who had committed many murders. The conflict went all the way up the chain of command, involving FBI headquarters in Washington and senior Justice Department officials making decisions. Eventually, the prosecutors won the argument. The indictments would move forward as planned. But by the time this decision was finally made, damage had already been done that would have profound consequences later. In December 1994, John Connolly, still working as Bulger and Flemmi's FBI handler, received word that indictments were coming very soon. And Connolly did what he had done for many years without hesitation. He warned his informants about what was coming. The warning gave Bulger and Flemmi time to prepare themselves. They could destroy evidence, hide their money and assets, and most importantly, decide whether to surrender and fight the charges in court or run away and become fugitives from justice. Whitey Bulger made his choice very quickly, without hesitation. He had been preparing for this possibility for many years, gathering up cash, creating false identities with fake names, making plans for how to disappear if it ever became necessary. In late December 1994, just before the indictments were going to be handed down officially, Whitey Bulger vanished completely. He would remain a fugitive running from the law for 16 long years. One of the FBI's most wanted criminals, living under fake names in various locations around the United States, before finally being caught in California in 2011. His running away was a huge embarrassment for the FBI and added to growing suspicions that the FBI had been protecting him for many years. Stephen Flemmi made a different choice for himself. He decided to stay and fight the charges in court. Maybe he believed that his relationship with the FBI would protect him even now after all these years. Maybe he thought he could beat the charges if they went to trial, and he could argue his case. Maybe he simply didn't have the same escape plan that Bulger had prepared ahead of time. Whatever his reasoning was, Flemmi didn't run away when Bulger did. That decision would ultimately lead to him spending the rest of his life in federal prison, but not before his trials and testimony would expose the full scope of FBI corruption and the shocking number of murders he had committed. On January 5, 1995, federal agents arrested Stephen, the Rifleman Flemmi, at a restaurant in Boston where he was eating. For the first time in many decades, he was facing serious criminal charges without the FBI's protection behind him. The FBI wasn't coming to rescue him this time like before. Instead, the FBI was part of the arrest team arresting him. An irony that wasn't lost on anyone who knew the history of Flemmi's relationship with the Bureau over the years. The indictment was wide and covered many things. Flemmi was charged with racketeering, which included specific acts of murder, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder together, conspiracy to commit extortion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The government was saying that Flemmi had been a leader of an ongoing criminal organization, the Winter Hill Gang, that had been doing decades of criminal activity all throughout the Boston area. Initially, Flemmi claimed he was innocent of the charges. His legal plan appeared to be to deny everything completely, to challenge the government's evidence in court, and to possibly use his relationship with the FBI as a defense for his actions. His lawyers started preparing for what would be a complicated and possibly long trial ahead. But then something happened that changed everything completely. Flemmi's lawyers found documents showing that he had been an FBI informant for many decades. This discovery was explosive on many different levels at once. First, it meant that Flemmi had been operating with FBI protection while committing the very crimes he was now charged with. Second, it suggested that the FBI had evidence about his criminal activities that it had hidden or ignored for many years. Third, and maybe most importantly for Flemmi's legal strategy, it raised the possibility that he could claim he had been given permission by the FBI to commit crimes as part of his informant activities. When Flemmi's FBI informant status became public knowledge, it sent shock waves through Boston's criminal justice system and beyond to the whole country. Suddenly, questions that journalists and state police investigators had been asking for years were being taken seriously at last. If Flemmi had been an FBI informant while committing murders, what did the FBI know about those murders at the time? Had the FBI actively protected a serial killer who kept killing? How many other crimes had the FBI allowed its informants to commit without stopping them? The revelation also raised urgent questions about Whitey Bulger, who had run away before his arrest. Was Bulger also an FBI informant all along? Had Connolly warned him about the indictments before they came? Had the FBI basically allowed one of America's most dangerous criminals to escape justice? As reporters dug deeper into the story, they discovered that yes, Bulger had also been an FBI top informant, just like Flemmi, and yes, there was strong evidence that he had been warned about the indictments before they were officially announced. The FBI's corrupt relationship with Flemmi and Bulger was being exposed in real time for everyone to see, and the Bureau's reputation was taking devastating damage with each new revelation that came out. Federal prosecutors found themselves in a difficult position with this case. They had a strong case against Flemmi for serious crimes, but now his defense was going to involve his relationship with the FBI in a big way. Flemmi's lawyers were arguing that he had freedom from prosecution for his crimes because he was working as an FBI informant, or at least that he reasonably believed he had such freedom, based on his relationship with the FBI. This defense strategy, while creative and interesting, faced serious legal problems ahead. Federal courts have generally decided that law enforcement agencies cannot authorize serious crimes like murder and that, even if an FBI agent had told Flemmi he could commit crimes that wouldn't count as legal permission. But the strategy did highlight the corrupt nature of Flemmi's relationship with the FBI and created serious public relations problems for the Bureau that were hard to fix. The FBI was forced to do internal investigations into how its informant program had been corrupted so badly. Congressional hearings were held to ask questions. The FBI's director had to testify about what the Bureau knew about Flemmi and Bulger's criminal activities, and why they had been protected for so long without consequences. John Connolly, Flemmi's FBI handler, was at the center of these investigations. By this point, Connolly had retired from the FBI, but evidence was building up that he had been corrupt throughout his relationship with his informants. Investigators found proof that Connolly had accepted money and gifts from Bulger and Flemmi, had spent time with them socially quite often, had warned them about investigations coming, and had actively worked to protect them from prosecution for years. In 1999, John Connolly was arrested and charged with racketeering conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to cover up. His arrest sent another shockwave through law enforcement everywhere. A former FBI agent was being prosecuted for basically working for the criminals he was supposed to be investigating. The corruption had gone deeper than even the most suspicious observers had thought possible. But Connolly's prosecution was just the beginning of what would come out. As federal prosecutors kept investigating the relationship between the FBI and its informants, they found evidence of murders that had been committed with FBI knowledge, or that the FBI should have been aware of if agents had been doing their jobs properly and paying attention. Families of victims who had spent many years searching for answers suddenly found themselves at the center of big investigations getting attention. The families of Brian Holler and Michael Donahue, Deborah Davis, Deborah Hussey, and many others were finally learning the real truth about what had happened to their loved ones all those years ago. And they were learning that the FBI had protected the killers, in some cases for many decades without doing anything. The civil lawsuits that followed would cost the government tens of millions of dollars in payments. Families sued the FBI for wrongful death, arguing that the Bureau's protection of Flemmi and Bulger had made possible the murders of their loved ones. Many of these lawsuits were successful, resulting in large settlements or jury awards that gave them some justice. For Stephen Flemmi, sitting in federal custody while all of this was happening around him, the situation was becoming more and more clear. He wasn't going to be protected by the FBI anymore at all. His informant status, rather than being the shield that had protected him for decades, was now being exposed as part of one of the biggest law enforcement scandals in American history that would be remembered. He faced a difficult choice: go to trial where he would almost certainly be convicted and face many life sentences in prison, or work with prosecutors, admit he was guilty, and possibly get some leniency in exchange for testifying against others. As someone who had spent his whole criminal career informing on others while committing crimes himself, Flemmi was very familiar with how cooperation worked. He understood how the game was played from long experience, and as evidence kept building against him, as more murders were connected to him, as witnesses came forward with testimony about his crimes, Flemmi started to think about his options carefully. By the late 1990s, prosecutors had connected him to many different murders. They had testimony from former associates who knew things. They had physical evidence from some crime scenes that couldn't be argued with. They had financial records showing his criminal income over the years. Most significantly, they had his own FBI files, which recorded years of criminal activity that the FBI had known about or should have investigated properly. The amount of evidence was too much to fight against. Flemmi's lawyers had to advise him that if he went to trial, he would likely be found guilty and spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of ever getting out on parole. His only real option was to negotiate a plea agreement that might give him some hope, however small, of eventually getting out of prison someday. But there was a problem that complicated things. Flemmi still claimed that he had been given permission by the FBI to commit crimes, or at least that he believed he had such permission from them. He wanted any plea agreement to admit this relationship existed and to possibly allow him to sue the government for damages, based on the FBI's corruption that had happened. These negotiations dragged on for many years, during which time Flemmi stayed in federal custody waiting. New discoveries about his crimes continued to come out all the time. Bodies that had been buried decades earlier were being found by investigators. Witnesses who had been too scared to come forward, while Flemmi and Bulger were free, were now willing to talk about what they knew. One of the most significant developments was the discovery of bodies at locations that prosecutors had learned about from cooperating witnesses. In January 2000, investigators started digging in an area of Dorchester where they believed bodies might be buried. They found the remains of many victims, including Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, who had been missing so long. The discovery of these bodies brought the full horror of Flemmi's crimes into clear focus for everyone. These weren't just accusations on paper anymore. These were actual human remains in the ground. People who had been murdered and buried in secret locations, whose families had spent many years not knowing what happened to them. The DNA identification of Deborah Davis's remains allowed her family to finally have some closure after so long, though the knowledge of what had happened to her, murdered by her boyfriend, a man protected by the FBI for many decades after her death, was devastating for her mother, who had spent nearly 20 years searching for answers without giving up. The truth was both a relief and an unbearable burden to carry. The identification of Deborah Hussey's remains and the eventual revelation that Flemmi had sexually abused her as a child before murdering her was maybe the most disturbing part of the entire investigation that came out. Marion Hussey, who had to face the reality that her longtime boyfriend had molested and then killed her daughter, became one of the most sympathetic and tragic figures in the whole case. These discoveries increased the pressure on Flemmi to work with prosecutors. Prosecutors now had physical evidence connecting him to many different murders. The defense strategy of claiming FBI permission for his crimes was becoming harder and harder to believe, as the full scope of his evil became clear to everyone. No one was going to believe that the FBI had given him permission to sexually abuse a child and then murder her to cover it up. In 2003, after many years of negotiations and legal moves, Stephen Flemmi entered into a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. He admitted he was guilty of 10 murders: Deborah Davis, Deborah Hussey, Brian Halloran, Michael Donahue, John McIntyre, Arthur Bucky Barrett, and 4 others whose names were listed, in exchange for his guilty plea and his agreement to work with ongoing investigations. Prosecutors agreed not to ask for the death penalty for his crimes. The plea agreement required Flemmi to testify truthfully about his crimes, about his relationship with Whitey Bulger, about his relationship with the FBI, and about the various criminal organizations he had been involved with over his long criminal career. He would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of ever getting parole, but he would avoid being executed, and he would have the opportunity to testify against others in court. For Flemmi, this was the best deal he could hope for at his age. He was in his 60s by this point, and he understood that he was going to die in prison no matter what plea agreement he made. But maybe testifying would give him some feeling of control over things, some opportunity to settle old scores with people, or just some way to feel like he still mattered to prosecutors. Flemmi's cooperation was valuable for several different reasons. First, he could give detailed testimony about murders that only he and Bulger knew about in detail. Second, he could testify about FBI corruption and John Connolly's role in protecting them all those years. Third, and maybe most importantly, he could give testimony that would be really important if and when Whitey Bulger was ever caught and brought to trial. The families of victims had mixed feelings about the plea agreement he made. On one hand, they wanted justice badly, and life in prison without parole was a form of justice they could accept. On the other hand, many felt that Flemmi deserved the death penalty for his crimes. Especially for the murders of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, they were so personal. They felt cheated that he would be allowed to live out his natural life, even if it was behind bars forever. But prosecutors explained that the plea agreement served important purposes for everyone. It made sure that Flemmi would spend the rest of his life in prison, which was the most important goal. It avoided the long appeals process that would have been necessary if he had been sentenced to death. And it got his cooperation in other investigations and possible trials ahead. The plea agreement also allowed for victim impact statements in court, giving families the opportunity to face Flemmi directly and tell him about the pain and suffering his crimes had caused them. These statements would turn out to be some of the most powerful and emotional moments in the whole legal process that happened. Stephen Flemmi's decision to work with prosecutors marked the beginning of a new phase in his criminal career, one where he would betray almost everyone he had ever worked with, give testimony that would help convict former allies, and reveal secrets about decades of criminal activity in Boston that had been hidden. True to his character, Flemmi's cooperation was calculated and selfish in nature. He gave information that helped prosecutors, but he also tried to make his own role in certain crimes seem smaller, to put blame on others when he could, and to present himself in the best light that circumstances would allow. Prosecutors and investigators who talked to him found him to be intelligent, manipulative, and completely lacking in any real regret for his crimes. One of the first targets of Flemmi's cooperation was John Connolly, the former FBI agent who had been his handler for so many years. Flemmi gave detailed testimony about his relationship with Connolly, describing how the agent had protected them, warned them about investigations coming, gave them information about cooperating witnesses, and accepted money and gifts in exchange for his protection over the years. Flemmi's testimony was really important in Connolly's trial. He described specific times when Connolly had tipped them off about investigations, had helped them find possible threats, and had actively worked to protect them from prosecution. He testified about social gatherings where Connolly would meet with them, about money that was given to Connolly, about the corrupt relationship that had made years of criminal activity possible. In 2002, John Connolly was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy, and obstruction of justice charges. The jury decided that Connolly had warned Bulger and Flemmi about indictments coming, letting Bulger run away. The conviction of an FBI agent for corruption related to how he handled informants was a stunning moment in the history of federal law enforcement that got attention. But Connolly's legal troubles weren't over yet. In 2008, he was tried in Florida for his role in the 1982 murder of John Callahan, a businessman who had become a problem for Bulger and Flemmi's organization. Flemmi testified that Connolly had given information that led to Callahan's murder happening. In 2009, Connolly was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison for it. The conviction and imprisonment of John Connolly gave some satisfaction to the families of the victims who felt that the FBI's corruption had made possible the murders of their loved ones. But it also showed just how deep the corruption had gone over the years. A federal law enforcement agent had basically become a member of the criminal organization he was supposed to be investigating. Flemmi also testified in various proceedings against other members of the Winter Hill Gang and people connected to his criminal organization. He gave information about murders, criminal operations, and how Boston's organized crime worked during his active years. His testimony helped prosecutors connect other criminals to unsolved murders and ongoing criminal activities they were investigating. But maybe the most significant part of Flemmi's cooperation was his detailed confession to the murders of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. These confessions, given during talks with prosecutors and later in court testimony, were chilling in how matter-of-fact they were about terrible crimes. About Deborah Davis, Flemmi admitted that he had killed her in 1981 because she wanted to leave him and because he was scared she might talk about his criminal activities to others. He described tricking her into coming to a house, choking her to death, and then getting rid of her body with Bulger's help. He admitted pulling her teeth to prevent anyone from identifying her, and burying her body in a location where it stayed hidden for nearly 20 years. The casual way he described these events, as if killing his girlfriend was just a practical problem that needed solving, showed the complete lack of empathy or conscience that marked his whole criminal career. During his testimony, family members of Deborah Davis sat in the courtroom, hearing in terrible detail exactly what had happened to their daughter and sister. The pain visible on their faces provided a strong contrast to Flemmi's cold, detached way of talking about the murder. About Deborah Hussey, Flemmi's testimony was even more disturbing to hear. He eventually admitted that he had sexually abused her when she was a child, though he tried to make it seem less bad and explain it away in ways that prosecutors and investigators found disgusting. He admitted killing her in 1985 because she was talking about the abuse and because he saw her as a threat to him. He described choking Deborah Hussey to death, getting rid of her body using the same methods he had used for other victims, and then lying to her mother, Marion, his girlfriend at the time, about what had happened to her. The revelation that he had stayed in a relationship with Marion Hussey for years after murdering her daughter, all while knowing where Deborah's body was buried, was almost too cruel to understand. Marion Hussey's testimony during various proceedings was heartbreaking to hear. She described her relationship with Flemmi, her trust in him, her years of wondering what had happened to her daughter. She described the devastation of learning that the man she had loved and lived with had sexually abused and then murdered her child. Her testimony made clear the full human cost of Flemmi's crimes and the FBI's decision to protect him all those years. Flemmi also gave testimony about murders that prosecutors hadn't known about before or couldn't prove happened. He described the murders of many people, giving details about where bodies were located, methods used to kill them, and reasons for the killings. Some of those bodies were never found again, but his testimony at least gave families some understanding of what had happened to their loved ones. His cooperation extended to testifying about other unsolved murders in the Boston area that had remained mysteries. He gave information about killings that he had personal knowledge of, even when he hadn't directly participated in them. He testified about how organized crime generally worked in Boston during his active years, helping prosecutors understand the full scope of criminal activity that had been happening. Throughout his testimony in various proceedings, Flemmi showed the same calculating intelligence that had marked his criminal career. He spoke clearly and well. He remembered details accurately, and he could describe complicated criminal operations in ways that juries could understand easily. But he also tried to make his own blame seem smaller when he could, to put blame on Bulger or others, and to present himself as someone who had been tricked or forced into crimes he wouldn't otherwise have committed. Prosecutors and investigators who worked with him found this last part especially annoying. Flemmi was trying to present himself as someone who had been corrupted by his relationship with Bulger, or tricked by the FBI, when the evidence clearly showed that he had been a very productive killer long before he ever met Bulger, and that his relationship with the FBI had been one of mutual using rather than him being tricked. The various trials and court proceedings where Flemmi testified went on for more than a decade. Each one brought new revelations about crimes that had been committed, about victims whose fates had been unknown, about the corruption that had made decades of criminal activity possible. And each one brought victims' families back to court to go through their trauma again, and to hear in painful detail what had happened to their loved ones. The victim impact statements that were given during various sentencing proceedings were powerful and full of emotion. Family members described the pain of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, the years of searching for answers, the impact on their lives of losing someone to violence, and their anger at the FBI for protecting the men who had murdered their family members. Many of these family members focused their anger not just on Flemmi and Bulger, but on the FBI itself as an institution. They pointed out that their loved ones had been murdered by FBI informants, that the FBI had known or should have known about these murders happening, and that the FBI's corrupt informant program had made these deaths possible. Their testimony showed the institutional failure that had let Flemmi kill without consequences for so many years. The civil lawsuits that families brought against the FBI resulted in large settlements and jury awards of money. Courts decided that the FBI had been careless in how it handled informants, that the Bureau had broken its own rules, and that this carelessness had helped cause the deaths of victims. The money cost to the government went into tens of millions of dollars paid out, but no amount of money could truly make up for families' losses they had suffered. For Stephen Flemmi, his cooperation didn't result in any reduction in his sentence at all. He was already serving life without parole, but it did give him a feeling of still being important somehow. He was still someone prosecutors wanted to talk to, still someone who had valuable information, still someone who mattered in some strange way for a man who had spent his whole life wanting power and control. This may have given him some mental satisfaction, even as he faced the reality of dying in prison eventually. The various trials and legal proceedings that came from Stephen Flemmi's criminal career and his cooperation with prosecutors went on for more than 15 years, from his first arrest in 1995 through Whitey Bulger's trial in 2013 and even beyond. These proceedings showed the full scope of his crimes, the FBI's corruption, and the terrible impact on victims' families. Flemmi's own legal proceedings went through several different phases over time. At first, after his arrest in 1995, he fought the charges against him, claiming that his status as an FBI informant gave him freedom from prosecution. This claim was eventually rejected by courts, which decided that law enforcement agencies cannot authorize serious crimes like murder, and that even if FBI agents had told Flemmi he could commit crimes, such permission would not be legal. The legal fight over his FBI informant status took years to finish and involved looking at many documents and testimony about how the FBI's top echelon informant program worked. The proceedings revealed shocking details about how the program operated, how much freedom FBI agents had in managing their informants, and how little oversight existed to stop the kind of corruption that had marked Flemmi's relationship with John Connolly. In 2003, as mentioned earlier, Flemmi finally made his plea agreement, admitting he was guilty of 10 murders and agreeing to work with ongoing investigations. His official sentencing came in 2004, when he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of ever getting parole. The sentencing hearing included victim impact statements from family members of many victims. The victim impact statements were extremely powerful and emotional. Patricia Donahue, widow of Michael Donahue, who was killed alongside Brian Halloran in 1982, spoke about raising her 3 children alone after her husband's murder, about the years of wondering why no one was prosecuted for the killing, and about her anger at learning that the FBI had protected the killers all along. Her testimony was emotional and dignified, and it showed the real human cost of the FBI's corruption that had happened. Stephen Davis, brother of Deborah Davis, spoke about his sister's murder and the family's decades-long search for answers about what happened. He described how the family had suspected that Flemmi was responsible for Deborah's disappearance, but couldn't get law enforcement to do anything about it. He expressed anger that the FBI had protected Flemmi for years after Deborah's murder, letting him keep killing while the Davis family searched desperately for their daughter and sister. Marion Hussey's testimony about her daughter was maybe the most heartbreaking of all. She described her relationship with Flemmi, her trust in him, and the devastating discovery that he had sexually abused and murdered her daughter while staying in a relationship with her for years. Afterwards, she spoke directly to Flemmi, telling him that she hoped he would suffer in prison for what he had done to her family. The raw emotion in her testimony left few people in the courtroom without feelings. Flemmi showed little visible emotion during these impact statements from families. He sat quietly, sometimes looking down at the floor, but mostly keeping the same expressionless face that had marked how he acted throughout the proceedings. His lack of visible regret was noticed by observers and added to the feeling that he was basically unable to feel empathy or real human emotion like normal people. The judge who sentenced Flemmi emphasized how serious his crimes were and the betrayal of trust involved in his murders of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. The judge noted that Flemmi had shown no real regret for his actions and that the only appropriate sentence was life in prison without any chance of ever getting parole. John Connolly's trial in 2002 was another important proceeding where Flemmi's testimony played a big part. Connolly was charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice related to his corrupt relationship with Bulger and Flemmi. The trial showed in detail how an FBI agent had basically become a member of the criminal organization he was supposed to be investigating. Flemmi testified at length at Connolly's trial, describing their relationship over nearly 20 years. He testified about specific times when Connolly had warned them about investigations coming, about money and gifts they had given to Connolly, about social gatherings where Connolly met with them, and about information Connolly had given that let them find and get rid of possible witnesses. The prosecution presented evidence that Connolly had made false FBI reports to make his informants seem more valuable than they were, had leaked information about investigations to his informants, and had actively worked to stop investigations by other law enforcement agencies. The evidence showed a pattern of corruption that had gone on for years and had made many murders possible. Connolly's defense argued that he had been following FBI procedures for handling informants and that any protection he gave was approved by his bosses above him. But the jury didn't accept this defense, deciding that Connolly had gone far beyond approved activities and had actively taken part in a criminal enterprise. The conviction of John Connolly was an important moment in the history of FBI corruption being exposed. It showed that even federal law enforcement agents could be held responsible for corruption, and it gave some justice for families who felt that the FBI's protection of Flemmi and Bulger had made possible the murders of their loved ones. Connolly's later conviction in Florida for second-degree murder in connection with the John Callahan killing added to his prison time and showed how serious his corruption was. The Florida jury decided that Connolly's giving of information to Bulger and Flemmi had directly led to Callahan's murder, making Connolly criminally responsible, even though he hadn't actually done the killing himself. But the trial that created the most public interest and media attention was Whitey Bulger's trial in 2013. Bulger had been a fugitive running from the law for 16 years after running away in late 1994. He was caught in June 2011 in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living under a fake name with his longtime girlfriend. His capture was national news everywhere, and the trial that followed got a lot of media coverage. Bulger was charged with 19 murders, along with racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and weapons charges. The trial, which started in June 2013, was expected to have testimony from Stephen Flemmi, his former partner, and now cooperating witness for the prosecution. The courtroom meeting between Flemmi and Bulger was one of the most awaited moments of the whole trial. These two men had been partners for nearly 20 years, had committed many crimes together, and had both been protected by the FBI for decades. Now, Flemmi was testifying against his former partner, giving details about their crimes and their relationship. When Flemmi took the witness stand, the tension in the courtroom was so thick you could feel it. Bulger, who had been refusing to cooperate throughout the trial, stared at his former partner as Flemmi started his testimony. Flemmi, now in his late 70s, looked calm and composed as he described their partnership and the crimes they had committed together over the years. Flemmi testified about specific murders, describing how he and Bulger had planned and carried out killings together. He testified about their criminal operations, about their relationship with John Connolly, about how they had used their FBI informant status to get rid of competitors and witnesses who might testify. His testimony was detailed and damaging, connecting Bulger directly to many murders. Bulger's lawyers tried to make Flemmi's credibility seem weaker, pointing out that he was a convicted murderer who was testifying to avoid more charges. They emphasized his cooperation agreement and suggested that he was lying or making things worse to please prosecutors. They pointed out differences between his various testimonies over the years, suggesting that he couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. But Flemmi's testimony was supported by other witnesses, by physical evidence found, and by Bulger's own FBI informant files that were discovered. The defense's attacks on Flemmi's credibility, while strong, couldn't beat the amount of evidence connecting Bulger to the crimes he was charged with. One especially dramatic moment came when Bulger's lawyers questioned Flemmi about his murders of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. The defense tried to suggest that Bulger hadn't been involved in these particular murders, that they were only Flemmi's crimes alone. Flemmi, however, testified that Bulger had been present and had helped in getting rid of the bodies afterward. The exchange showed how deeply evil both men had become and how far they had gone to protect themselves. Flemmi was on the witness stand for several days, going through aggressive questioning by Bulger's lawyers. Throughout his testimony, he kept the same cold, emotionless manner that had marked his earlier court appearances. He answered questions directly, gave details when asked, and showed no visible emotion. Even when talking about the most terrible crimes, family members of victims sat in the courtroom during Flemmi's testimony, hearing once again the details of how their loved ones had been murdered for many of them. Bulger's trial represented another chance to see justice done, but it also meant going through the trauma of their losses again and facing the men responsible for destroying their families. In August 2013, The jury found Whitey Bulger guilty on 31 counts, including involvement in 11 murders. The jury decided that the prosecution had proven Bulger's participation in these murders beyond any reasonable doubt, relying in part on Flemmi's testimony, but also on testimony from many other witnesses and lots of physical evidence found. Bulger was sentenced to 2 life sentences in a row, plus 5 more years. The judge emphasized how serious his crimes were and the decades of terror he had brought to Boston. Bulger showed no regret, claiming to the end that he had never been an FBI informant despite overwhelming evidence that he had been. Bulger was moved to a federal prison in West Virginia, where in October 2018, he was killed by other prisoners there. He was 89 years old at the time. His death in prison brought some closure to the whole story, though it also meant that he never faced complete responsibility for all of his crimes. Throughout all of these trials and proceedings, Stephen Flemmi stayed in prison, serving his life sentence without any chance of parole ever. His testimony in various trials was finished, and prosecutors no longer needed his help for any ongoing investigations. He had done his job as a cooperating witness, and now he faced the reality of spending the rest of his life locked up behind bars. The aftermath of Stephen Flemmi's criminal career and the exposure of FBI corruption goes far beyond the courtroom convictions and prison sentences given. The impact spreads through families who lost loved ones, through the FBI as an organization forced to face its failures, through Boston as a city that had to deal with decades of organized crime made possible by corrupt law enforcement, and through the broader criminal justice system as it learned lessons about informant management and organizational responsibility. The families of victims kept carrying the weight of their losses decades after the murders happened. For many of them, learning the truth about what happened to their loved ones brought both closure and new trauma. They finally knew what had happened after all those years, but the knowing brought with it the terrible details of how their family members had died, and the knowledge that the FBI had protected the killers for decades afterwards. Patricia Donahue, whose husband Michael was killed in 1982 simply because he was giving Brian Halloran a ride, became one of the strongest supporters for victims' families seeking justice. She filed a lawsuit against the FBI, arguing that the Bureau's protection of Bulger and Flemmi had directly caused her husband's murder to happen. In 2009, a federal jury gave the Donahue family $84 million, finding that the FBI was responsible for Michael Donahue's death. The verdict was a confirmation for the family, but also a clear admission of how deeply the FBI's corruption had caused tragedy. The Davis family, after decades of searching for Deborah, finally learned in 2000 that her remains had been found and identified correctly. The knowledge that Flemmi had murdered her because she wanted to leave him, and that the FBI had protected him for nearly 2 decades after her death was devastating to them. Stephen Davis, Deborah's brother, became a strong critic of the FBI and a supporter for changing the informant program that had failed his sister so badly. Marion Hussey's trauma was maybe the most profound of all the victims' families going through this. She had to face not only the murder of her daughter, but also the sexual abuse Deborah had suffered, and the fact that the man who committed these crimes had been her romantic partner for years. Marion had unknowingly lived with her daughter's killer, shared a life with him, trusted him while he hid the truth about what he had done to her child. The mental impact of these discoveries was huge, and Marion needed a lot of therapy and support to deal with the trauma she experienced. The civil lawsuits brought by victims' families resulted in over $100 million in settlements and judgments against the FBI. Courts repeatedly decided that the FBI had been careless in how it managed informants, had broken its own rules and had created the conditions that made murders possible. These money awards, while large, represented only a small part of the true cost of the FBI's failures within the FBI. The exposure of corruption in the Boston office led to big changes in how the Bureau manages informants. The top echelon informant program, which had given individual agents a lot of freedom in handling high-level criminal sources, was reorganized to include more oversight and responsibility. New rules were put in place requiring more frequent reviews of informant activities, more complete documentation of information given by informants, and stricter limits on what crimes informants could be allowed to commit. The FBI also put in better systems for sharing information between different field offices and with other law enforcement agencies, fixing one of the key problems that had let Bulger and Flemmi operate without consequences for so long. But organizational change is difficult, and critics say that the FBI has never fully dealt with what happened in Boston honestly. Some former FBI agents keep defending the informant program and argue that the protection given to Bulger and Flemmi was worth it because of the intelligence they gave about the Mafia. This defensive attitude has frustrated victims' families and reform supporters, who believe the FBI needs to more fully admit its failures. Congressional hearings after the scandal looked at how such widespread corruption could have gone unnoticed for so long. Testimony showed that there had been warning signs for years. Complaints from state and local law enforcement, questions from some FBI agents about the informant program, and reports from informants and other criminal organizations about Bulger and Flemmi's activities. But these warning signs had been ignored or dismissed because of organizational commitment to protecting sources and making cases against the Mafia. The hearings also showed problems with FBI culture, including too much loyalty to fellow agents, not wanting to admit mistakes, and an organizational arrogance that led FBI agents to dismiss concerns raised by state and local law enforcement. The congressional investigations resulted in suggestions for change, though putting these suggestions into practice has been uneven. Boston as a city also had to face its own part in the corruption for years. There had been rumors and suspicions about Bulger and Flemmi's relationship with law enforcement, but few people were willing to speak out publicly. The code of silence that governed much of Boston's neighborhoods had let the corruption continue. As people who knew or suspected what was happening chose not to come forward, the political connections that had protected Bulger, especially his brother Billy Bulger's position as president of the Massachusetts State Senate, were also looked at closely. While Billy Bulger was never charged with any crimes related to his brother's activities, questions were raised about what he knew and when he knew it. Billy Bulger's eventual resignation from his position as president of the University of Massachusetts, forced in part by disagreement over his relationship with his criminal brother, was seen by many as a form of responsibility for the political establishment's tolerance of corruption. The exposure of FBI corruption also affected how juries and the public see cooperating witnesses in criminal cases now. The knowledge that the FBI had protected serial killers while using them as informants created doubt about how reliable informant testimony is and the ethics of cooperation agreements. Defense lawyers in criminal cases often mention the Bulger and Flemmi case when questioning how believable cooperating witnesses are. The cultural impact of the story has been large and lasting. Many books have been written about Bulger, Flemmi, and FBI corruption in Boston, including Black Mass by Dick Lear and Gerard O'Neill, which became a complete account of the scandal. The story was made into a 2015 movie starring Johnny Depp as Whitey Bulger, bringing the story to an even bigger audience. These cultural depictions have helped keep the story in people's minds, But they've also caused arguments about whether such portrayals make criminals look good or properly teach people about corruption and its results. Victims' families have had mixed reactions to these cultural representations, liking that the story keeps being told, but sometimes uncomfortable with how criminals are shown. Stephen Flemmi stays in prison at Coleman II U.S. Penitentiary in Florida, a medium-security federal prison. He is now 90 years old now, spending his last years behind bars with no chance of ever getting out. His life in prison is reportedly pretty routine and quiet. He follows prison rules, talks with other prisoners in limited ways, and spends much of his time alone. Reports from prison officials describe Flemmi as a quiet prisoner who causes few problems. He reportedly reads a lot, watches television, and keeps little contact with the outside world. He has had few visitors over the years, as most people who once had relationships with him have either died, stopped contact, or want nothing to do with him mentally. Flemmi appears to have never really understood how morally terrible his crimes were. In his various testimonies and interviews, he has never shown real regret. He describes his murders in matter-of-fact ways, as if they were business choices rather than the taking of human lives. This lack of empathy, this inability or unwillingness to face the full moral weight of what he did has been noted by psychiatrists and observers throughout his legal proceedings. Some experts who have evaluated Flemmi suggest he shows signs of antisocial personality disorder, a lack of empathy, a willingness to use violence to achieve goals, an ability to control others, and an absence of real regret. Whether this represents a medical diagnosis or just describes the personality of a career criminal is debatable. But it's clear that Flemmi is basically different from most people in his emotional and moral makeup. Flemmi's extended family has mostly rejected him. His children from various relationships have reportedly stopped contact with him, wanting nothing to do with their father after learning the full scope of his crimes. The murders of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey especially made it impossible for family members to keep any relationship with him. The ongoing investigations into unsolved murders from Flemmi's era have occasionally brought his name back into the news. Law enforcement officials have talked to him about other possible crimes, about bodies that haven't been found, about information that might help solve cold cases. Flemmi has sometimes given information, though investigators remain doubtful about whether he's being completely truthful or still hiding information about more crimes. Some families of victims whose cases remain unsolved keep pushing for answers, hoping that Flemmi might eventually give information about their loved ones. But as he gets older and as the decades pass, the chance of getting complete answers to all the questions about his criminal career gets smaller. The broader lessons of the Stephen Flemmi case continue to be important through law enforcement and the criminal justice system. The case is often talked about in training programs for law enforcement officers as an example of how informant programs can be corrupted and how organizational failures can make terrible crimes possible. The case has also been studied by criminologists and sociologists looking at organized crime, police corruption, and the ethics of using criminal informants. Academic papers and books have looked at various parts of the case, from the mental profile of serial killers to organizational failures within the FBI, to the social factors that let organized crime grow in Boston for so long. For Boston itself, the Flemmi and Bulger story represents a dark chapter in the city's history that won't be forgotten. The neighborhoods where they operated, South Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, have changed a lot since the height of their criminal power, but the memories stay. Older people remember the fear that filled these neighborhoods when Bulger and Flemmi were active, the feeling that these men could not be touched, the knowledge that crossing them could mean death. Younger generations in Boston learn about this history as part of understanding their city's past. Schools and community organizations use the story as a warning about corruption, about the importance of speaking out against wrongdoing, about how systems meant to protect people can sometimes fail badly. The physical places connected to Flemmi's crimes have taken on a sad meaning. The locations where bodies were buried, the houses where murders happened, the businesses that were threatened. These places are part of Boston's dark history, though families of victims generally wish they would be forgotten rather than remembered as murder sites. As we reach the end of this long journey through Stephen Flemmi's criminal career, it's important to step back and look at the bigger questions raised by this case. How did one man get away with so much for so long without consequences? What organizational failures made his crimes possible? What lessons can be learned to stop similar tragedies in the future from happening again? The most basic question is how Stephen Flemmi was able to commit at least 10 murders he admitted to and was involved in up to 20 or more over 3 decades while being protected by the FBI. The answer lies in a mix of factors: organizational corruption, wrong priorities, not enough oversight, and the moral compromises involved in using criminals as informants. The FBI's top echelon informant program was built on a basically wrong idea that the government could partner with active criminals, let them keep committing some crimes, and use their intelligence to prosecute other criminals, all while keeping ethical boundaries that would stop the most serious crimes. In theory, this might have been possible with perfect oversight, clear ethical rules, and agents who strictly followed those rules in real life. The program created huge opportunities for corruption to happen. Individual FBI agents had too much freedom in managing their informants, and too little oversight to make sure they weren't crossing ethical lines. The organizational culture within the FBI valued making cases and protecting sources above other things, including justice for victims of crimes committed by those sources. And the FBI's competitive relationship with state and local law enforcement meant that warnings from those agencies about informant wrongdoing were often dismissed as territory fights rather than real concerns. John Connolly's corruption was made possible by this organizational structure. He was able to protect Bulger and Flemmi for years because the FBI gave him a lot of freedom in managing his informants, didn't seriously question his claims about how valuable they were, and supported him when other law enforcement agencies tried to investigate his sources. The FBI's organizational commitment to taking down the Italian Mafia was so strong that warnings about what Bulger and Flemmi were actually doing were ignored or dismissed. This raises uncomfortable questions about whether the ends justify the means approach to law enforcement is right. The FBI argued that protecting informants, like Flemmi, was necessary to make cases against the Mafia, which the Bureau saw as the biggest organized crime threat. But at what cost to innocent people? Is it acceptable to let informants commit murders in order to prosecute other criminals for murders? Is it acceptable to destroy dozens of families in order to make racketeering cases? The answer, looking back now, seems clear: no. The cost was far too high for everyone involved. But at the time, FBI agents and bosses convinced themselves that the intelligence Bulger and Flemmi were giving was worth the protection they received. This reasoning let the corruption continue for many years, with each murder being explained as an unfortunate but necessary result of keeping valuable sources. Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi stays behind bars at Coleman II Penitentiary in Florida at the age of 90 now. A reminder that eventually, even after decades of avoiding justice, the truth catches up in the end. He will die in prison, having spent the last decades of his life locked away from the world he once terrorized and controlled. There is some justice in that, though it came far too late for his many victims who suffered. His story is a reminder of the darkest abilities of human nature. The ability for violence, for control, for deep moral corruption. It's a story about how systems meant to protect people can fail badly when organizational priorities go against ethical principles. It's a story about the real human cost of corruption, measured not in abstract ideas, but in lives destroyed and families broken apart. The bodies are buried now, most of them found and identified after decades in unmarked graves without names. The trials are finished and over. The criminals are in prison or dead now. But the results of Stephen Flemmi's crimes keep echoing through Boston and through the lives of everyone touched by his violence. If this story has kept you company tonight, if it's helped you understand something about the nature of evil, about organizational corruption, or about the importance of justice and responsibility, then think about subscribing for more deep looks into the dark parts of criminal history. These are stories that need to be told, not to make criminals look good, but to understand how and why such things happen and how we might stop them in the future. What part of this story shocked you the most? Was it how many murders happened? The FBI's corruption? How personal some of the crimes were? Leave a comment down below and share your thoughts with us. These conversations help us work through these difficult stories and think about their bigger meanings. Check out our other true crime deep looks. We have stories about other famous criminals, about other cases of corruption and injustice, about the dark parts of history that shaped our world. Give this video a like if you found it helpful and well-researched. Share it with anyone who likes thorough, thoughtful looks at true crime stories. And remember that understanding these dark parts of history isn't about celebrating violence or making criminals look good. It's about remembering the truth, honoring the memories of victims, and learning lessons that might stop similar tragedies in the future from happening. Until next time, sleep well and be thankful that you're on the right side of the law. Be thankful for the normal human ability for empathy and moral thinking that people like Stephen Flemmi completely lack. And be thankful that despite all the failures of the justice system in this case, eventually the truth came out and some justice was served. The Rifleman's time of terror is finally over. The bodies have been found at last. The truth has been told completely. And somewhere in a federal prison cell, a 90-year-old man thinks about the end of a life spent in darkness, knowing that he will die as he has lived for the past many decades, locked away from the world forever. A warning about what happens when evil is allowed to grow without being stopped for too long. Sleep well, and remember that the path of the moral universe is long and slow, but it eventually bends toward justice in the end.